Tonight, let's set aside the grand chronicles of kings and the complex tapestries of philosophy. Instead, we'll journey to a place far more immediate and relatable, the bustling, greasy, and wonderfully aromatic world of the medieval marketplace. We're about to explore the surprisingly rich history of what can only be described as medieval junk food. This is a story about the simple, everyday pleasures and guilty indulgences that brought moments of profound joy to people living in a time often defined by hardship and scarcity. So find your cozier spot, let the modern world recede, and prepare to discover the snacks and treats that people craved centuries before the first fast food restaurant ever lit up a sign. It's easy for us to envision the Middle Ages as a period devoid of the simple, satisfying snacks we take for granted. In a world that knew nothing of vending machines, hot dog carts, or brightly coloured candy wrappers, it might seem like indulgence was a foreign concept. Yet, human ingenuity, particularly when fueled by a persistent craving, has always been a powerful force. People of that era masterfully found ways to create treats that were by turns delightfully delicious, deeply comforting, and, to our modern sensibilities, frankly a bit disturbing. Each of these creations, born from necessity and a waste not, want not ethos, offers us a perfect, greasy, and flavorful snapshot of what it meant to be alive and hungry in a long-forgotten world. Before we get completely lost in the historical aromas of the past, if you find value and relaxation in these quiet explorations of forgotten history, please take a brief moment to support the channel. A simple click on the like button or a subscription truly helps more than you can imagine. I'm also always genuinely curious to see where our global community is tuning in from, so feel free to leave a comment telling us your location and what time it is in your part of the world. It's a wonderful way to see our campfire grow. Now, with that said, it's time to settle in. Go ahead and dim your lights, maybe turn on a gentle fan to create that soft, soothing background hum, and let the outside world fade away as we travel back together. Let's ease into our culinary exploration of the past. In an era where the very word, snack, often meant chewing on a piece of unforgivingly stale bread or sipping a bowl of lukewarm broth, the apple fritter emerged as a rare and triumphant victory for the senses. These weren't just food, they were little golden beacons of pure happiness. Imagine a treat that was simultaneously sweet, blisteringly hot right from the fryer, and carried just a hint of delicious danger, much like any memorable medieval decision. These delightful, sizzling pucks of fried dough were the closest ancestor to our modern donut, though they existed in a world without the convenience of neatly piped frosting or the assurance of modern food's safety standards. They were a simple pleasure, made all the more special by the bleakness of the culinary landscape that surrounded them. So, what exactly composed one of these coveted fritters during the medieval period? The star ingredient, of course, was the apple, but you can banish any image of the glossy, perfectly uniform fruit from today's supermarkets. Instead, picture the kind of apples that were small, intensely tart, and wonderfully gnarled, the sort that might grow untended behind the local old house, or perhaps be sneakily procured from a neighbour's overhanging branch. These were chopped coarsely and then folded into a simple, rustic batter made from flour, eggs, and often a generous splash of oil. Using oil wasn't just for flavour. In a time when clean water was a constant concern, it was a safer, more reliable liquid that also had the pleasant side effect, making any snack feel just a little more festive and cheerful. Following the mixing of the simple batter came the most dramatic and enticing part of the process, the frying. Deep frying anything in the 1300s was an act of pure culinary theatre, a spectacle of sizzling and popping that promised a delicious and decadent reward. The cooking medium of choice was typically rendered pig fat, a precious substance that was used and reused so many times it might have developed its own distinct personality and a lengthy history of every food ever cooked within it. To say this repeated use added flavour is perhaps a charitable description, but there's no denying the outcome was something uniquely alluring. The final product was a fritter that was irresistibly hot, wonderfully crispy on the outside, and possessed a strangely addictive quality that kept people coming back for more, grease stains and all. To pull a fresh fritter directly from that bubbling pan of hot fat was to hold a small, fleeting piece of pure joy in your hands. It offered a delightful textural contrast, with perfectly crisped, golden brown edges giving way to a soft, steamy, and sweet apple-filled center, all while posing a mild but ever-present risk of a third-degree burn on your tongue. If you were fortunate enough to be wealthy, your fritter might arrive dusted with a fine coating of exotic, imported sugar, a luxury so rare that its presence was less about flavor and more about making a powerful social statement. For the common folk, a generous drizzle of golden honey or a fragrant spiced syrup accomplished the same goal of adding sweetness, creating a treat so delightful it could make you momentarily forget that your next meal likely consisted of cabbage, pretending its best to be something more exciting. Fritters were the quintessential street food of the Middle Ages, a quick and deeply satisfying indulgence you could purchase on the go. You would find them being sold at bustling fairs, a welcome treat after a long and solemn church service, or on busy market days when the enticing aromas of frying dough were simply too powerful to resist. They were universally adored. Children clamoured for them, adults saw them as a worthy and greasy escape from their daily labours, and even opportunistic birds were known to try their luck at stealing a piece. This was a snack that was fun, fast, and just decadent enough to erase all thoughts of the pickled turnips that awaited you back at home. While they could sometimes be imperfect, when a fritter was made well, it was a truly sublime experience, a single bite capable of explaining how people found moments of pure happiness in the often challenging medieval world. If the apple fritter held the esteemed title of the medieval donut, then cheese curds could be considered the era's charmingly rustic answer to popcorn, a snack that was bite-sized, satisfyingly simple, and famously inconsistent from one batch to the next. These little dairy morsels were not designed for glamour or elegance. They lacked the dramatic, stringy stretch of melted mozzarella and the flashy presentation of an artisanal cheese board. In fact, their defining characteristic was their charming simplicity and their refusal to do much of anything at all, which is precisely what made them such a perfect, unassuming snack. Their pleasure was found in their unique squeaky texture against the teeth, and their straightforward salty kick, a humble and reliable treat in a complicated and often difficult world. Let's be perfectly clear, the cheesemakers of the medieval period were not striving for aesthetic perfection, or the kind of photogenic quality that would trend on social media today. Their primary goal was intensely practical, to create a product that could be produced quickly, eaten just as fast, and most importantly, endure the harsh realities of the time. This meant that any cheese had to survive long, bumpy journeys, be stored in less than ideal, unrefrigerated conditions, and even withstand the occasional misplaced hoof of a wandering goat. In this context, cheese curds were essentially cheese in its infancy, the fresh, tender morsels that were separated from the whey long before the remaining curd was pressed, salted, and aged into a hard, durable wheel that could just as easily serve as a building material. These delightful little clumps of dairy goodness were a happy and incredibly useful byproduct of the larger cheese-making operation. To create them, farmers would introduce rennet, a substance that sounds elegant until you learn it's derived from the stomach lining of a young calf or lamb, to fresh milk. This caused the milk to magically separate into solid curds and liquid whey. Once separated, the fresh curds were lightly pressed to remove any excess moisture, tossed with a bit of salt for preservation and flavor, and that was essentially it. The result was a snack with a wonderfully unpredictable personality. Sometimes the curds were soft and mild, other times they were firm and rubbery, and they often produced a distinct and satisfying squeak against your teeth as you chewed. In a time when your only other snacking options were likely a chunk of old, hard bread or a bowl of cold, uninspiring broth, The simple pleasure of a handful of cheese curds felt like a genuine culinary victory. They were beloved by all strata of society, a truly democratic food. Monks, with their self-sufficient abbeys, were especially fond of them as a simple yet nourishing food. Wary travelers would pack them for their long journeys, valuing their portability and their protein content. Children would happily devour them like candy, assuming the local cows had been feeling generous with their milk that week. They were versatile enough to be fried until golden, crumbled over a hearty stew, or simply eaten by the handful while you tried your best to ignore the fact that you smelled faintly of a dairy barn. Let's establish a fundamental truth. Right from the start, the turnip is not, by any modern definition, a dessert ingredient. However, to truly understand its peculiar place on the medieval sweet table, you must first transport yourself to a world where refined sugar was a treasure more valuable than gold, where sweet apples were a fleeting seasonal luxury, and where creative desperation was a primary and highly respected culinary skill. It was in this challenging environment that some inventive, or perhaps just very hungry, individual looked at a humble, earthy turnip and had the audacious thought, "Oh, I believe I can make this into a pie." And with that questionable stroke of genius, the turnip pie was conceived, forever blurring the line between a root vegetable and a dessert. To be entirely fair to this much maligned dish, the turnip pie wasn't always the culinary disaster that its name might suggest. When prepared with care and a bit of luck, it could actually be surprisingly pleasant. The ideal version started with tender, well-mashed turnips, which were then blended with a bit of egg to create a rich, custard-like binder. If the cook was feeling particularly generous or celebrating a special occasion, a drizzle of precious honey or a handful of chopped dried fruit might be mixed in. This concoction was then poured into a very sturdy pastry shell, a crust built more for structural integrity than for flaky delicacy. At its absolute best, the finished pie was a warm, subtly sweet and comforting dish with a unique pudding-like texture that was quite satisfying. The widespread popularity of turnip pies can be attributed to two very practical medieval realities. Turnips were astonishingly cheap and abundantly available year-round, and a thick, hearty pie crust is excellent at hiding a multitude of culinary imperfections. It didn't much matter if the turnips themselves were a bit past their prime, slightly undercooked, or possessed a suspicious bitterness that hinted at their earthy origins. Once they were baked into a pie and camouflaged with a bit of honey or spice, the dish was transformed into a form of peasant cuisine with lofty and respectable aspirations. No one was ever going to mistake it for a delicate cheesecake or a rich fruit tart, but you had to admire its plucky determination. In the challenging world of medieval Europe, simply making an effort to create something special counted for a great deal. If you were to nominate a single dish for the title of the medieval world's most valuable comfort food, the meat pasty would undoubtedly be a leading contender and a very strong candidate to win. This ingenious creation was essentially a handheld pie, featuring a savory and satisfying filling of seasoned meat and vegetables all neatly and securely encased in a folded pastry crust. It was then baked until it achieved a perfect golden brown hue, though a slight scorching around the edges was common and often considered part of its rustic charm. The best way to picture it is as the original, handmade hot pocket, but without the convenience of a microwave and with the added thrill of a genuine, if mild, sense of danger regarding its mysterious and often varied contents. It was the ultimate all-in-one meal for a world in constant motion. The true genius of the meat pasty lay in its remarkable portability, a feature that made it an indispensable part of everyday medieval life. It was the perfect meal to be eaten on the road during a long and dusty journey, carried into the fields for a hard-working labourer's midday lunch, or even consumed while taking in the day's rather grim public entertainment, which might very well have been a public execution. The thick, sturdy pastry crust served a crucial dual purpose. It not only kept the savoury filling warm for a considerable amount of time, but also acted as a protective, edible container, shielding the precious contents from the dirt of the road, the curiosity of rats, and the occasional, poorly timed sneeze from a fellow peasant. Now, let's have an honest discussion about that savoury filling. The word meat, in the context of a medieval pasty, was an exceptionally flexible and often wonderfully ambiguous term. If you were fortunate enough to live near a great manor or a well-stocked hunting estate, your pasty might contain recognizable and desirable cuts of pork, mutton, or even luxurious venison. For everyone else, however, the list of potential ingredients expanded quite dramatically and included just about anything that could be caught, trapped, or otherwise procured. This meant your pie could be filled with rabbit, pigeon, eel, or even the surprisingly common hedgehog. Spices like pepper and garlic were used liberally, not just to enhance the flavor, but more realistically, to cleverly disguise the fact that the filling might have been sitting around for a day or two longer than would be considered ideal by modern standards. These pasties came with their own set of unique and practical traditions that evolved over time. It was a common practice for labourers and miners, who often took these pies to work for their midday meal, to have their initials inscribed on the crust to prevent any lunchtime mix-ups in a crowded environment. Furthermore, in many regions, particularly in the tin mines of Cornwall, the pasty was designed with an extra thick, heavily crimped crust along one edge. This feature served as a convenient built-in handle, allowing the pie to be held securely with dusty or dirty hands. After the filling was eaten, this soiled crust was often discarded, sometimes as an offering to the spirits of the mines, but far more realistically, as a welcome snack for the ever-present and opportunistic rats. In a world where modern dental hygiene was centuries away, and the most common method for cleaning one's teeth involved a vigorous rinse with wine and a hopeful prayer for the best, candied fennel seeds emerged as the closest medieval equivalent to a breath mint. These tiny, sugar-coated seeds were a multifaceted marvel, functioning simultaneously as a sweet treat to be enjoyed after a meal, a respected digestive aid to settle a heavy stomach, and unfortunately, a significant and ever-present dental hazard. They represented a curious intersection of medicine, confectionery, and personal risk, all encapsulated in a single, distinctively crunchy and aromatic bite. To consume one was to engage in a complex sensory experience that was part pleasure and part peril, a tiny luxury with a big personality. The creation of these tiny, sugared seeds was a testament to the immense dedication required for medieval confectionery. Sugar, often brought back from distant lands through expensive trade routes, was a precious, almost mythical substance. It had to be painstakingly boiled, beaten, and poured by hand into its desired form by skilled artisans. This laborious process meant that someone, somewhere, truly saw the potential in these humble fennel seeds to transform them into a high-status delicacy. Their primary audience was the nobility, where the seeds played a starring role in the theatre of after-dinner hospitality. In these grand households, a small, ornate dish of candied fennel would be passed among guests, a subtle yet unmistakable display of the host's wealth and access to exotic goods. Beyond their role as a sweet treat, these candied seeds were tasked with a crucial medicinal duty aiding digestion. Medieval feasts were often heavy, greasy affairs involving multiple courses of rich meats and an abundance of ale or wine. It was widely believed that fennel possessed properties that could help settle a protesting stomach after such an indulgent meal. Think of them as a medieval fusion of a breath mint and an antacid tablet, but with a significant and ironic drawback. Despite their intended health benefit, the seeds were incredibly hard. The sugar coating, once set, became almost stone-like, posing a very real threat to the eater's dental integrity. You didn't simply pop one in your mouth and chew, you had to approach it with caution, a tiny game of risk versus reward. If the often unpredictable world of medieval desserts had a beloved and reliable star performer, it was unquestionably the honey cake. This confection was a dense, sweet, and wonderfully sticky creation that seemed to embody the very essence of comfort. Honey cakes were the natural result of an ambitious baker's desire to create a sweet treat in a time when refined sugar was still a rare treasure, often locked away in the castle treasury alongside jewels and gold. Honey, on the other hand, was the sweetener of the common person, or at least for any person who had access to bees and was brave enough to face the very real possibility of getting stung while harvesting the golden liquid. This accessibility made the honey cake a widespread and cherished delight across all social classes. The construction of these cakes was elegantly simple, typically involving a straightforward mix of flour, water, and, of course, generous helpings of rich, fragrant honey. The resulting bake was not a light and airy sponge, but a firm, profoundly chewy slab of confection. Depending on the skill of the baker and how long it had been left sitting by the hearth, a slice of honey cake could either be a delightfully satisfying snack or a serviceable, if sticky, makeshift doorstop. To elevate the cake from simple to special, spices were sometimes introduced, a clear signal that the household was either feeling particularly wealthy or simply showing off for guests. A dash of nutmeg, cloves, or cinnamon could lend the cake an exotic flair, turning it into the talk of the village for a week. Honey cakes were a staple at nearly every significant social gathering, from lively festivals to solemn weddings and grand feasts. Their popularity was due in large part to their incredible durability. They could be baked well in advance, they didn't spoil easily, and they were robust enough to survive being dropped, jostled in a travel bag, or even used as a harmless projectile in a minor food fight. This resilience also made them an excellent gift, or, in some cases, a form of currency or bribe. One can even imagine them being used in a passive-aggressive context, a host presenting a cake to a guest with the pointed comment, "I baked this for you." It's sweet, unlike your recent behavior. They were a versatile and ever-present part of medieval social life. Now we turn to fried fish skin cracklings, perhaps one of the most unexpectedly brilliant snacks to arise from a culinary tradition that also confidently championed the eel pie. These crispy, salty, and feather-light strips were anything but glamorous, yet they were the perfect embodiment of medieval efficiency. They were a testament to the guiding principle of waste not, want not, a philosophy that was especially crucial when dealing with a fish, an ingredient that often carried a faint aroma of silent judgment. This wasn't a dish born from a chef's creative vision, it was a discovery born from pure, unadulterated thrift. It was the happy result of someone refusing to let anything, no matter how humble, go to waste in their kitchen. Let's be realistic. No one in a medieval kitchen deliberately set out to invent this particular dish. It's far more likely that a resourceful cook, having finished filleting a catch of herring or cod, was left staring at a pile of discarded skins and had a moment of profound inspiration. What would happen if I just fried these? A splash of hot fat and a sizzle later, a new snack was born, and it turned out to be shockingly addictive. The process transformed the skin into a thin, brittle crisp that crunched like a dry autumn leaf, but delivered a concentrated, savory flavor of the ocean. A simple pinch of salt was enough to elevate the experience from interesting to irresistible, and a hint of garlic or herbs would push it into the realm of true, if accidental, culinary excellence. These fishy cracklings were far more than just a tasty morsel. They were an eminently practical source of sustenance. They were incredibly lightweight, making them easy to carry. They were also high in fat and calories, providing exactly the kind of quick energy a medieval body needed after a long day of hard labor, like hauling firewood or defending one's flock of sheep from a rival's flock. This made them a favorite among various groups. Soldiers packed them in their rations for long marches, sailors relied on them during sea voyages, and enterprising peasants would sell them by the handful outside of taverns, enjoying both the few coins they earned and the satisfaction of feeding inebriated patrons, something that crunched even louder than their boisterous conversations. When the realities of medieval life presented you with nothing more than stale bread and a tankard of lukewarm beer, you didn't despair. Instead, You created the most quintessentially medieval snack imaginable, bread soaked in ale. This humble concoction, known by various names such as sops or trench toast, was the absolute pinnacle of early comfort food. You might try to picture it as an ancestor of French toast, but to do so, you must first strip away the eggs, the sugar, the cinnamon, and virtually all of the associated joy. It was a dish born not of indulgence, but of the fundamental need to make every last crumb of food edible, and to waste absolutely nothing. It was survival turned into a comforting, if soggy, meal. The preparation was as simple as it was ingenious. You would take yesterday's bread, which by that point had often achieved a hardness comparable to a building brick, and you would submerge it in a bowl of ale. This wasn't a fancy craft ale with complex notes. It was the standard flat, low-alcohol brew of the era, likely made in a smoky back room with questionable hygiene standards. The bread, like a sponge with deep-seated trust issues, would cautiously absorb the liquid, slowly softening and swelling, until it transformed from a potential jawbreaker into something manageably soft and vaguely chewable. It was a warm, bready mush that carried the gentle bitterness of fermented grain, a flavour that, while not exciting, did not actively offend the palate. If you've ever stared at a simple slice of bread and had the fleeting thought that it could be significantly improved by being submerged in alcohol, then you share a surprising culinary sensibility with the medieval upper class. Enter sops in wine, one of the more refined, if bizarrely specific, snacks of the Middle Ages. This dish was technically considered a dessert, though it might be more accurately described as a culinary experience. The concept was deceptively simple. Take a piece of bread, ideally toasted to give it some structural integrity, and ceremoniously dunk it into a goblet of wine. This was the aristocratic answer to the commoner's ale-soaked bread, a simple substitution that elevated the dish from sustenance to a clear statement of social status. Naturally, one did not use just any wine for this sophisticated dish. The wine of choice was typically mulled, heavily sweetened, or infused with expensive spices like cinnamon and cloves. This was a warm, fragrant, and complex liquid that did an admirable job of masking the fact that it had probably been sitting in a large clay jug since the previous year's harvest. Once the bread was thoroughly saturated, it was presented as a soft, spoonable delicacy, something nobles would refer to as elegant. This was a dish to be consumed slowly, with a spoon, perhaps while feigning interest in the meandering melodies of a lute player. It frequently appeared at the end of banquets or during awkward dinners where no one wished to discuss politics, so they passed around soggy, wine-soaked toast instead. In the grand pantry of the Middle Ages, dried fruit was held in the highest esteem. It was a treasured delicacy, celebrated for being sugary, vaguely exotic, and, most importantly, shelf-stable enough to survive long journeys, including an entire crusade. However, it is crucial to understand that this was not the tender, conveniently packaged trail mix we know today. Medieval dried fruit was a utilitarian food with a singular purpose: to last for as long as possible. Considerations like taste were secondary. Its texture was often aggressively chewy, and the potential for dental damage was practically a built-in feature of the snacking experience. It was a concentrated burst of sweetness and luxury in a world where both were exceedingly rare. The typical selection of medieval dried fruit included the usual suspects: wrinkly raisins, dense figs, sticky dates, and, for the truly affluent, imported prunes. These fruits had been preserved through various methods, such as drying in the sun, smoking over a low fire, or simply being forgotten on a windowsill until they had achieved a state of profound dehydration. The primary advantage of this process was that it concentrated the fruit's natural sugars, turning these shriveled morsels into the medieval equivalent of candy. Nobles adored them, monks were known to hoard them in their monasteries, and children regarded them as precious loot plundered from the kitchen. The significant downside, however, was that chewing them often felt like engaging in a prolonged battle with your own jaw muscles. Despite the effort required to eat them, Dried fruits were a versatile and valued ingredient in the medieval kitchen. They were frequently chopped up and baked into pies, stirred into porridge to add a touch of sweetness and texture, or incorporated into dense honey cakes to create an illusion of greater variety and luxury. The wealthy, always looking for ways to display their status, would take things a step further. They might have their cooks wrap the dried fruits in delicate pastry, drizzle them with fragrant rose water, or soak them in spiced wine, all in an effort to impress a visiting guest, perhaps one who had travelled all the way from Florence. For them, dried fruit wasn't just food, it was a canvas for culinary ostentation and a symbol of their connection to faraway lands. Imagine waking up with a deep, gnawing hunger, a craving for something substantial, something fried, and something with a bold, assertive flavour that might just bite back. For this specific need, the medieval world offered the blood pudding ball. This was a snack so dense, so unapologetically iron-rich, and so deeply savoury that it makes a modern sausage roll look like a timid, uninspired breadstick. These savoury spheres were born from the noble and practical tradition of utilising every single part of a slaughtered animal. They stood as delicious, crispy proof of the "wast not, want not" philosophy, even when the part you were determined not to waste was, in fact, blood. It was the ultimate nose-to-tail snack, a product of pure medieval practicality. Let's break down the assembly of this formidable snack. The process began with the collection of fresh animal blood, usually from a pig, though in a pinch, any available blood would suffice. This was then thoroughly mixed with hearty oats for substance, suet a hard, beef fat for richness, diced onions for flavour, and a blend of savoury spices. Once this rather morbid-looking porridge achieved a state of grim stickiness, it was shaped by hand into balls. These were then plunged into a skillet of sizzling hot fat and fried until the outside became dark and crisped up, as if it had something important to prove to the world. The final product was a dark, orb-like morsel of protein-packed sustenance, boasting a deep, earthy flavour, which is polite code for tasting distinctly of iron and mystery for the remainder of the day. Blood pudding balls were not a dish associated with elegance or refined dining, but they were exceptionally practical. They were easy to transport, incredibly high in calories, and so alarmingly filling that they were a meal in themselves. If you managed to eat 2, you could comfortably skip lunch. If you ate 4, you were either a hard-working blacksmith in need of serious fuel, or you were trying to win a very questionable dare. These hearty snacks were a common sight at bustling fairs, open-air markets, and roadside stalls where the air was thick with the smells of livestock and ambition. They were particularly popular during the colder months because, after all, what warms the body and soul quite like a ball of fried coagulation? They were a functional food for a hard-working populace. To properly appreciate the medieval pancake, you must first forget everything you know about its modern descendant. Banish all thoughts of light, fluffy stacks drizzled with maple syrup and adorned with whipped cream. The pancakes of the Middle Ages were a different beast entirely. They were typically thinner, significantly tougher, and cooked in a quantity of lard sufficient to make one's arteries contemplate filing for early retirement. But they were effective. They filled the belly and provided much-needed energy. And in a world where the alternative breakfast option was often a thin, watery soup that seemed sad about its own existence, a greasy pancake felt like a genuine and welcome treat. It was a simple, satisfying, and caloric start to a long day of labour. These early pancakes were crafted from a humble and straightforward mixture of flour, eggs, and a liquid which could be either water or, more often, ale. This simple batter was then ladled onto a sizzling iron griddle that had been generously coated in bubbling pig fat. There were no non-stick pans or precise portioning tools. The cook would simply pour and hope for the best. The result was a flat, uneven circle, usually characterized by delightfully crispy, browned edges and a center that remained slightly dense and chewy. This was the kind of pancake that was durable enough to survive a long ride on horseback and still be mostly edible upon arrival at your destination. It was sometimes burnt, sometimes a little raw, but always a welcome sight on the medieval breakfast table. One of the pancake's most remarkable qualities was its truly democratic nature. It was a food that effortlessly transcended the rigid social hierarchies of the era. You could find them being enjoyed by everyone, everywhere. A humble peasant might eat one plain, rolled up tightly for a quick, filling meal in the fields. A scholarly monk in the quiet of his monastery might enjoy his layered with a bit of sharp cheese. And a noble, while likely having access to far more extravagant fare, would not turn their nose up at a well-made pancake, perhaps served with a drizzle of honey or spiced wine. It was a universal comfort food, adaptable enough to be eaten sweet, savoury, or even scorched beyond easy recognition if the cook got distracted. If any were left over, their durable nature meant they could be stacked and repurposed. We now encounter a food that existed in the curious space between a simple snack and a sacred object, the medieval wafer. This was a thin, impossibly crisp, and suspiciously light biscuit that seemed to dance delicately on the line, separating earthly dessert from a divine dental challenge. Wafers were a common sight in the medieval landscape, appearing in the most varied of places. You would see them being sold by vendors just outside the heavy doors of a church, at bustling village fairs amidst the jugglers and merchants, clutched in the hands of pious monks, and sometimes, bizarrely, found floating in a bowl of soup like a flat, holy croton. Their texture was their defining characteristic, an ethereal crispness that made them feel both special and slightly perplexing to eat, a food that was more air than substance. It's important to clarify that we are not discussing the cream-filled, chocolate-dipped wafers of the modern age. The medieval wafer was an exercise in simplicity, crafted from a thin batter of flour, water, and eggs, with very little else added. A particularly fancy baker might add a whisper of honey or a few drops of fragrant rose water for special occasions, but the vast majority stuck to the unadorned basics. This liquid batter was then poured onto hot metal wafer irons, which were often engraved with intricate patterns. These plates were then pressed together, much like a medieval panini press, instantly cooking the batter into a delicate, paper-thin disc. The final product looked as though it belonged in a communion ceremony, but tasted, charmingly, like crispy paper with grand ambitions. The popularity of wafers was driven by their practicality and profitability. They were wonderfully portable, could be made very quickly, and, most importantly, they could be produced in enormous quantities, making them a lucrative item for any aspiring vendor. Enterprising sellers would strategically set up their stalls outside churches, timing their sales to coincide with the end of Mass on feast days. They would wave tempting stacks of the warm, patterned wafers at the faithful as they emerged, a business model that, while not explicitly buy now, sin later, certainly carried that general vibe. The patterns imprinted by the irons, whether floral, geometric, or the vague visage of a saint, added no flavour, but gave you something to contemplate as you chewed thoughtfully. Let us now explore a medieval treat whose name alone sounds delightfully sticky and indulgently suck it. This confection was, in essence, a piece of fruit that had been thoroughly boiled into sweet submission, then drowned in a thick, sugary syrup and effectively sealed in a jar like a sweet little hostage. To properly picture it, imagine glistening pieces of candied orange peel, succulent dates, or fiery ginger, all coated in so much sugar that they make your teeth tingle just looking at them. It was the kind of treat that made your conscience whisper, "You probably shouldn't be eating this." But you absolutely did anyway, because it was exquisitely delicious, almost certainly imported at great cost, and a welcome distraction from a diet that was otherwise lacking in such intense sweetness. Sucket was by no means a snack for the common person, not for the everyday peasant who might be subsisting on their seventh onion of the week. This was a confection reserved for the highest echelons of society, an elite-tier indulgence served in the grand halls of nobles. It was often presented as a prestigious gift, a way for a wealthy individual to say, "I hold you in high regard, but not quite enough to grant you a parcel of land." Given that sugar was a costly import and fresh fruit was a seasonal luxury, sucket was reserved for the most special of occasions. It would appear at extravagant weddings, during royal visits, or perhaps on a random Wednesday if you were outrageously wealthy and felt like flaunting it. The process for creating sucket was nothing short of ambitious, a true declaration of war on moisture itself. First, the chosen fruit would be boiled in a rich syrup, which could be made from either honey or, for the truly opulent, refined sugar acquired from a well-connected spice merchant. After the first boiling, the fruit was drained, allowed to dry slightly, and then the entire process was repeated, sometimes several times over. The goal wasn't merely to preserve the fruit, it was to completely saturate it with sugar until it transformed. The final result was a glossy, jewel-toned piece of candy, intensely flavorful, profoundly chewy, and so overpoweringly sweet it could likely be weaponized in large enough quantities. It was a painstaking and luxurious art form. For our grand finale of medieval junk food, we arrive at fried eel. This was a dish so strangely and universally beloved that it successfully navigated its way from the humble peasant's hearth to the most lavish royal banquets, all without once pausing to ask itself, "Wait a minute, am I truly the best option available here?" The answer, unequivocally, was yes. Eel was an abundant resource in medieval Europe. Rivers and streams were practically breathing with them, making them easy to catch and cheap to prepare. Though it was slippery when raw, bonnier than one might expect, and shaped like the primary villain in a fish-themed horror story, the eel was consumed by the bucket load. The reason was simple when fried. It was surprisingly crispy and delicious, and most importantly, it wasn't turnips. The journey of an eel from river to plate began with the challenge of catching it, an activity usually undertaken at night when the creatures slithered through shallow waters like sentient, muscular noodles. This was followed by the notoriously unpleasant task of skinning them, a process that was described as being less like preparing a normal fish and more like wrestling a wet, slippery rope that stubbornly refused to accept its fate. Once the eel was finally subdued and skinned, it was chopped into sections, seasoned with herbs if the cook was feeling bold, and then tossed into a pan of sizzling hot fat. The heat worked a miraculous transformation, turning the unappealing raw product into a crunchy, savory, and vaguely appealing delicacy that was enjoyed by all. Fried eel was a versatile dish served in a wide array of medieval settings. It was a popular hot food at fairs and feasts, a staple on the menu at roadside inns, and, believe it or not, a common meal during periods of religious fasting. That's right, because the eel was a water dweller, it wasn't technically classified as meat. In the dietary regulations of the church, this clever loophole meant that it could be eaten during Lent and on other fast days, slipping through the rules like, well, an eel itself. This made it a favourite of monks looking for a break from plain bread and vegetables, and it was openly flaunted by nobles. Kings were even known to have it baked into magnificent pies, which were then paraded across banquet halls. In the ancient world, the vast and fertile plains of Mesopotamia served as a crossroads where mystery and mythology converged, and nowhere was this more apparent than in their perception of dreams. To the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, a dream was never a private, meaningless fantasy generated by the sleeping mind. Instead, they viewed it as a divine telegram, a supernatural message dispatched directly from the gods to a person's subconscious. To ignore such a message was not just foolish, it was considered an act of profound disrespect, akin to leaving a direct communication from a powerful god like Enlil unread. This was a dangerous oversight that no sensible person would risk. By approximately 2500 BCE, the cultures of Mesopotamia had cultivated a highly sophisticated and systematic approach to dream interpretation, meticulously recording their findings on clay tablets using cuneiform script. These dream records were not treated as mere bedtime novelties or amusing curiosities. They were integral tools used in the highest levels of statecraft, in the practice of medicine, and within the most sacred religious rituals. A king might postpone an entire military campaign if a court interpreter deciphered a troubling dream as a bad omen from the heavens. Likewise, a simple farmer, after dreaming of a goat flying across the sky, would refuse to plant his crops, believing the world itself was constantly speaking through these visions. At the heart of this system were the professional dream interpreters known as Biru priests, who functioned as the ancient world's equivalent of Freudian analysts. Albeit without the leather couch, these specialists were rigorously trained in vast libraries filled with omen texts, the most famous of which was the Ivkar Zark, Ku, or the Dream Book. This was an elaborate manual that categorized thousands of dream scenarios and their prescribed meanings with an eerie, almost formulaic precision. For example, dreaming of eating dates was a clear sign of a good omen to come. Dreaming that your teeth were falling out, however, was a dire warning to expect a death in the family. Dreaming of a romantic encounter with a goddess could mean you were either divinely favored or cursed with arrogance. Traveling westward to the fertile banks of the Nile, we find that in ancient Egypt, dreams were elevated to an even higher status, viewed not merely as nightly occurrences but as sacred, living texts in motion. The Egyptians held the profound belief that every dream was a purposeful message delivered from the gods, from the spirits of one's revered ancestors, or even from a person's own ka, their spiritual twin or life force. According to their cosmology, no dream, whether good or bad, was ever random. Each one arrived with a specific intent. It could be a divine warning of impending danger, a blessing of good fortune, a set of sacred instructions for a ritual, or a vision designed to strike terror into the heart of the dreamer. By the time of the New Kingdom, which flourished from roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, the Egyptians had begun to meticulously document their system of dream interpretation in what are now considered some of history's earliest dream manuals. The most famous surviving example of these is the Ramesside Dream Book, a remarkable document written on papyrus that was unearthed in the ancient village of Deir el-Medina, home to the artisans who built the royal tombs. This was no light or casual reading material. It functioned as a divine diagnostic tool, methodically list of hundreds of possible dream scenarios and interpreting each one based on a binary outcome, whether it would prove to be favorable or utterly disastrous for the dreamer. The interpretive logic used in this ancient Egyptian dream manual was not always straightforward or intuitive to a modern mind. For instance, the text states that if a man sees himself eating the flesh of a crocodile in a dream, it is a good omen, signifying that he will become a high-ranking official. While this may seem strange, it is perfectly logical within the framework of Egyptian cosmology. The crocodile was the sacred animal of the god Sobek, a powerful deity who embodied strength and pharaonic power. Therefore, to dream of consuming a crocodile was to symbolically absorb its divine attributes, making it a clear omen that a promotion was on the horizon. Each interpretation was deeply rooted in their specific religious and symbolic understanding of the world. As we move across the Mediterranean to the ancient Greek world, we find that dreams were considered more than just divine whispers. They were seen as direct clinical appointments with the gods themselves. This belief was most powerfully embodied in the ritual practice of incubation, a sacred ceremony where an individual would intentionally go to sleep inside a temple with the express hope of receiving a healing vision or divine guidance in their dreams. While several deities were associated with dreams, none was more closely linked to this specific healing practice than Asclepius, the revered god of medicine. His temples became sacred hospitals for the soul and body, where sleep itself was the primary form of treatment prescribed by the divine physician. At the great healing temples dedicated to Asclepius, known as Asclepia, which were established across the Greek world from the famous center at Epidaurus to the city of Pergamon, the sick and the desperate gathered to seek miraculous cures. However, instead of being prescribed medicines or surgical procedures, They were prescribed a very specific kind of sleep, one that was sacred, intentional, and performed under strict spiritual conditions. Before a person was allowed to enter the temple's sanctified sleeping quarters, called the abaton, they were required to undergo a series of purification rituals. These often included ceremonial bathing, a period of fasting, and sometimes the sacrifice of an animal as an offering. Only then could they lie down and wait for the god to visit them. The recorded effects of these dream incubations, whether they were genuine divine interventions, powerful psychosomatic reactions, or simply the result of a strong placebo effect, were often profound. The practice was so respected that even the most esteemed Greek physicians, including the legendary Hippocrates, acknowledged the diagnostic value of a patient's dreams. They did not dismiss these visions as meaningless nonsense. On the contrary, they believed that the sleeping body could reveal its internal state and ailments through symbolic imagery. For example, a dream of overflowing or turbulent water might be interpreted as an indication of kidney problems, while a dream of being crushed or suffocated could point to a serious chest ailment or respiratory issue. Across the entire ancient world, from the river valleys of Mesopotamia to the hills of Greece, one specific category of dream was held in higher esteem than all others: the prophetic dream. These were not considered to be mere messages or simple warnings. They were seen as direct and world-altering revelations, divine calls to action, or glimpses into the unwritten future. For the diverse cultures of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece, these prophetic visions were sacred transmissions from a higher plane of existence, representing a direct and unmediated link to the will of the gods, the whims of fate, or the mysterious clockwork mechanisms of the cosmos itself. To receive such a dream was a momentous and often life-changing event that could shape the destiny of individuals and nations alike. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, dreams were a recognized and respected channel for divine communication, and the Old Testament is filled with powerful examples. The story of Joseph is paramount. His own youthful dream of bowing sheaves of wheat foretold his eventual rise to power. Later, in Egypt, his interpretation of Pharaoh's dream of 7 fat cows being devoured by 7 thin ones was not just a prediction. It became the basis for a national strategy that saved the kingdom from a devastating 7-year famine. This act demonstrates how a single dream, correctly interpreted, could alter the course of history, showcasing dreams as a tool of statecraft and divine providence. Likewise, Mesopotamian kings often received dreams that were seen as divine guidance, foretelling battlefield victory or impending disaster. The formidable Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, for instance, famously claimed that the gods appeared to him in his dreams, offering a powerful justification for his actions in both war and governance. In a world where rulers were often seen as divinely appointed, a dream from the gods was the ultimate endorsement. It was a crucial political tool, cementing a king's legitimacy in the eyes of his subjects and enemies alike, proving his reign had celestial approval and that his ambitions were aligned with the will of heaven. While the Greek temples of Asclepius are perhaps the most famous centers of dream healing, the practice of ancient dream incubation also thrived in ancient Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. This region was a rich blend of Hittite, Phrygian, and later Greco-Roman traditions, all of which contributed to a vibrant culture of dream healing. The most fascinating example comes from the cult of Men, a Phrygian lunar god associated with cycles of healing, and, quite naturally, with the mysterious world of dreams. His temples often sat on hills, positioned as if to catch divine messages beamed down from the night sky into the minds of hopeful supplicants seeking cures or guidance. The rituals of Anatolian dream incubation had their own unique and fascinating twists. Worshippers might be instructed to walk along labyrinthine paths or sleep directly beneath celestial carvings, operating on the belief that their physical proximity to this sacred geometry would help to focus and clarify the divine messages they hoped to receive. Music, fragrant incense, and hypnotic chants were often employed as tools to carefully tune the sleeper's mind preparing it to achieve a state of heightened spiritual reception. This wasn't sleep for the purpose of mere physical rest. It was sleep as an act of ritual participation, an active seeking of divine connection. By the 2nd century CE, the ancient art of dream interpretation had matured from a mystical practice into a more disciplined and systematic craft. One man, Artemidorus of Duldis, a Greek scholar from Asia Minor, took it upon himself to collect, categorize, and systematize all of the available knowledge on the subject. The result of his life's work was the Oneirocritica, which stands as the most comprehensive and influential dream manual ever produced in the ancient world. Unlike the mystical scribes of earlier eras, who often veiled their interpretations in layers of divine mystery, Artemidorus approached the study of dreams with the methodical precision of a scholar and the insightful curiosity of a streetwise psychologist. The Oneirocritica was no mere mystical pamphlet. It was a massive 5-book tome, written in clear and accessible Greek, filled with thousands of documented dream scenarios and their proposed meanings. Artemidorus's methodology was revolutionary for his time. He claimed to have spent decades of his life traveling and collecting these dream accounts firsthand from people of every conceivable walk of life. His research subjects included sailors, merchants, prostitutes, soldiers, and artisans. His guiding logic was that if you truly want to understand the soul of a culture, you must listen to its collective dreams. This empirical approach was a radical departure from traditional, temple-based methods of interpretation. It is crucial to understand that not all dreams in the ancient world were perceived as benevolent gifts from the gods. Some were viewed as profound terrors that clawed their way up from the depths of the cosmos, dark, haunting visions believed to emanate from restless spirits, demonic forces, or even from the shadowy underworld itself. These experiences were not dismissed as mere bad nights of sleep or the result of a heavy meal. They were interpreted as serious supernatural events, dire warnings of impending doom, divine punishments for misdeeds, or terrifying omens of tragic things yet to come. To have such a dream was to feel the cold touch of a malevolent and unseen world. The Babylonians were among the first civilizations to formally differentiate between dreams of divine origin and those that came from these more malevolent forces. If a dream caused intense fear, physical illness, or significant distress, it was considered to be spiritually polluted, and a priest would be summoned to perform what were known as apotropaic rituals. These ceremonies involved cleansing spells, specific offerings, and symbolic actions, all meticulously designed to neutralize the dream's negative effect before it could manifest in the waking world. Similarly, Egyptians used protective amulets bearing the Eye of Horus to guard against these nightly assaults. In the complex political landscape of the ancient world, dreams were not just spiritual or psychological phenomena. They were frequently treated as valuable political assets. Astute rulers, influential priests, calculating generals, and charismatic prophets often learned to skillfully weaponize dreams to justify their decisions, to sway public opinion in their favor, or to consolidate their own authority. The logic was simple and effective. Since a dream was a private experience, its contents could not be independently verified. Therefore, when the gods allegedly spoke in someone's sleep, those in power were quick to seize the opportunity and declare to the world, "They spoke to me, and this is what they commanded." Alexander the Great provides a classic example of this practice. Before he launched his conquest of Egypt, he reportedly had a powerful dream in which the Egyptian god Amun welcomed him as his own son. This dream was then conveniently confirmed by the local oracle upon his arrival at the Siwa Oasis, who officially declared Alexander to be of divine offspring. Whether the dream was a genuine vision or a brilliantly staged piece of propaganda was ultimately irrelevant. The story alone was enough to solidify his rule and recast him in the eyes of his troops and his new Egyptian subjects as a living god, far more than a mere mortal conqueror. It was a masterful piece of public relations. Though the ancient temples have long since crumbled into dust, the legacy of ancient dream interpretation lives on, whispering through the corridors of time, science, and modern psychology. Much of what we believe about dreams today, our enduring fascination with their symbolism, our analysis of recurring motifs, and our fear of nightmares, has deep roots in these ancient frameworks that first attempted to map the enigmatic territory of the sleeping mind. The fundamental questions they asked about the meaning and purpose of our dreams are the very same questions we continue to explore thousands of years later, connecting us directly to our distant ancestors and their quest for understanding. When we fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries, we encounter the seminal figure of Sigmund Freud. Despite his staunch rejection of any religious or supernatural interpretations of dreams, his own psychoanalytic theories borrowed heavily from the symbolic and narrative structures that had been pioneered millennia before. In his groundbreaking 1899 book, The Interpretation of Dream, Freud argued that dreams were a royal road to the unconscious, expressing our repressed desires and fears through a coded language. To decode this language, he relied on the ancient tools of analyzing metaphor, symbol and narrative, essentially acting as a modern-day interpreter of the inner self. In the middle of the 19th century, the United States was a young and sprawling nation, a country that was quite literally stretching at its geographical and ideological seams. By the year 1860, California had officially been a state for a full decade, but due to its extreme isolation, it often felt more like a distant, semi-foreign cousin than a fully integrated sibling in the family of the Union. The eastern half of the country was a buzzing hub of activity, interconnected by cities, telegraph lines, and ever-expanding railroads. The western frontier, in stark contrast, remained rugged, remote, and painfully disconnected from this network of progress. A simple letter could take weeks to arrive. The inefficiency of the mail system was a significant problem, as the existing routes were both dangerously convoluted and agonizingly slow. The most commonly used path for mail heading to California was a lengthy sea journey. This route involved ships carrying the mail down the Atlantic coast, transferring it across the Isthmus of Panama by land, and then loading it onto another ship to sail back up the Pacific coast, a voyage fraught with the risks of tropical diseases, unpredictable weather, and countless logistical nightmares. Meanwhile, the primary overland route, which relied on stagecoaches, was notoriously perilous and slow, frequently getting bogged down by muddy trails or snowbound mountain passes. This significant time lag in communication was far more than a mere inconvenience. It posed a serious political problem for the nation. The federal government harbored a growing anxiety that California, feeling increasingly isolated and neglected, might eventually drift away from the Union, either in spirit or in actual loyalty. In an era when the dark clouds of secession were already gathering on the horizon, the task of maintaining a sense of unity across the vast continent was not just an idealistic goal, it was a matter of urgent national security. The physical distance had created an emotional and political distance that threatened the very fabric of the young country. The Pony Express did not simply materialize out of the dust and myths of the frontier. It was the calculated and ambitious brainchild of three prominent businessmen who ran the successful freight and stagecoach firm of Russell, Majors, and Waddell. Based in Missouri, this powerful trio, composed of William H. Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell, were already seasoned veterans in the challenging world of overland shipping, responsible for hauling massive amounts of freight and crucial government supplies across the wild frontier. However, in 1860, they set their sights on a far more radical and audacious goal: to dramatically speed up mail delivery to California. At that particular time, William H. Russell, the firm's charismatic salesman and visionary, was feeling immense pressure from several directions. His professional reputation had been tarnished by a series of financial scandals and failed business ventures, and he saw the Pony Express as more than just a patriotic service. For him, it represented a personal redemption arc, a grand and dramatic gesture that could restore his good name and, more importantly, win the favor of the federal government. His ultimate ambition was that if they could successfully prove that their high-speed relay system worked, they would be in the prime position to land an exclusive and highly lucrative federal mail contract. While Russell was the visionary salesman, it was his partner, Alexander Majors, who brought the essential logistical genius to the operation. A deeply devout and famously meticulous planner, Majors demanded unwavering discipline from all of his employees, going so far as to require every rider and station master to swear a solemn oath against drinking, cursing, and fighting. He was the architect of the Express's highly structured system, which included a chain of relay stations built every 10 to 15 miles and larger home stations every 75 to 100 miles. The third partner, William B. Waddell, the quietest of the trio, provided the crucial legal and financial backbone that held the ambitious venture together. The creation of the Pony Express route was a monumental undertaking, akin to building a fragile and precarious bridge across an entire continent, a bridge with no safety net and virtually no margin for error. The full distance of the route spanned nearly 2,000 miles, stretching from the starting point in St. Joseph, Missouri, all the way to Sacramento, California. This path cut through a dizzying and often dangerous array of landscapes, including rolling prairies, formidable mountain ranges, high arid deserts, and treacherous river crossings. To make this seemingly impossible idea work, the founders established a chain of approximately 190 relay stations, strategically spaced about the maximum distance a horse could gallop at full speed. The true backbone of the Pony Express, however, was not the riders or the stations, but the horses themselves, more than 400 of them in total. These animals were not chosen for their looks or their pedigree, but were selected for one reason alone: their sheer, unadulterated speed and incredible stamina. In the eastern portion of the route, across the vast prairies, fleet-footed thoroughbreds were the mounts of choice. But in the rugged western sections, across the treacherous mountains and barren deserts, it was the compact and exceptionally hardy mustangs that carried the mail. These horses were the Ferraris of the frontier, capable of sustaining a full gallop between stations, where riders would make a lightning-fast exchange. A Pony Express rider's life was a daily gamble, a relentless gauntlet of dangers played out across the vast and unforgiving American West. Yet, despite the overwhelming perils, the wrath of nature, the threat of armed enemies, and the crushing weight of a landscape that often seemed determined to swallow them whole, these mostly teenage boys pressed ever forward. They braved the blinding blizzards of the Sierra Nevada, the blistering heat of the Nevada desert, and sudden, violent thunderstorms that could turn a dry path into a torrent of impassable muck. A slip from a horse in freezing conditions could mean a slow death from hypothermia, while one wrong move in a swollen river could result in a swift drowning. It was a world of constant peril. The historic debut of the Pony Express took place on the momentous day of April 3, 1860, in the bustling town of St. Joseph, Missouri, where a great crowd gathered at the Pikes Peak Stables building, their excitement a tangible force in the air. The inaugural rider, a young man most historical accounts identify as Johnny Fry, mounted his spirited horse, took the specially designed leather mail pouch known as a mochila, and with a crack of the reins, dashed off westward at a breakneck speed. As he disappeared into the horizon, the crowd erupted in cheers and cannons fired a thunderous salute. Just like that, with that single burst of speed, a new and thrilling chapter in the story of American expansion thundered vividly to life, promising to connect a divided nation. The mailbag, or mochila, that Johnny Fry carried on that first historic ride weighed approximately 20 pounds. It was filled not just with ordinary letters, but with newspapers, important business documents, and official government telegrams bound for the distant shores of California. In a beautiful and poignant symbol of the changing times, one of those telegrams had been wired from Washington, D.C. to the edge of the frontier and would now travel the remainder of its journey on horseback. This single act represented a perfect union of cutting-edge technology and raw, untamed human effort. At that very same moment, a counterpart rider in Sacramento, California, began his own journey eastward, launching the ambitious bidirectional relay. At the heart of the Pony Express's logistical brilliance was the mochila itself, a simple yet ingenious piece of equipment. It was designed with 4 locked leather pouches, called cantinas, where the precious mail was kept secure. The entire pouch was designed to be quickly slipped over the saddle horn, allowing a rider to leap from his exhausted horse and onto a fresh mount in under 2 minutes, all without having to unstrap a single buckle. This innovation was the key to maintaining the relentless pace of 10 miles per hour, a speed riders were expected to keep up even in the dead of night. The system was a triumph. That first delivery from Missouri arrived in Sacramento in just 9 days and 23 hours, proving the audacious concept could work. The true lifeblood of the Pony Express, the force that gave it its pulse and its legendary status, was not the swift horses, the lonely stations, or even the cleverly designed mochila. It was the riders themselves, a remarkable band of young, wary, and fearless daredevils who consistently defied brutal weather, vast wilderness, and the constant threat of war to deliver the mail. They were far more than simple couriers. They were living, breathing symbols of the nation's westward ambition, each one a legend in the making from the moment they first swung into the saddle. Their youth and slight build were not disadvantages but essential qualifications for a job where every ounce mattered and speed was the only true defense. The now famous recruitment advertisements for the Pony Express perfectly captured the brutal reality of the job. While the exact wording is likely the stuff of legend, they allegedly read, "Wanted young, skinny, wiry fellows not over 18. Must be expert riders willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred." Whether this ad ever actually ran in a newspaper is debatable, but the spirit behind it was absolutely real. It succinctly conveyed the perilous nature of the work and the very specific type of individual required to perform it. The company sought out young men who were lightweight, possessed exceptional equestrian skills, and, most importantly, had a courageous and perhaps reckless willingness to face mortal danger as a routine part of their daily lives. Over the course of its brief existence, some of the Pony Express riders became true folk heroes, their names etched into the mythology of the American West. A rider known as Pony Bob Haslam once completed an astonishing 380-mile ride in under 2 days, carrying the mail through a violent Paiute uprising and suffering wounds from arrows along the way. Another figure, William Buffalo Bill Cody, who would later achieve global fame as a Wild West showman, claimed to have ridden for the Express at the tender age of 15. While historians debate the accuracy of his tales, his later performances were instrumental in cementing the romantic image of the fearless teenage courier in the minds of millions, forever linking his name with the daring spirit of the service. Despite the immense dangers they faced, from environmental hazards to hostile encounters, the Pony Express system maintained an astonishingly high rate of reliability. The riders' sheer determination and the efficiency of the relay system meant that while the mail was sometimes delayed by unforeseen circumstances, it was very rarely lost. In fact, over the entire 18 months of its operation and across hundreds of thousands of miles traveled, only a single mochila was ever officially recorded as lost. This remarkable success rate stands as a powerful testament to the courage and unwavering dedication of the young men who rode the trail, proving that even in the most chaotic and unforgiving of environments, their mission almost always triumphed. Though it operated for a mere 18 months, the Pony Express had an impact on the United States that was swift, far-reaching, and undeniably profound. In a country that was teetering on the precipice of a devastating civil war and desperately trying to feel unified across its vast and fractured landscape, the Express delivered one message loud and clear: distance was no longer an insurmountable barrier. It proved the continent could be tamed and that the far-flung state of California could be brought into the national conversation in near real time, forever changing the perception of the American West and strengthening the bonds of a fragile union. Before the advent of the Pony Express, the flow of information across the country was painfully slow. Important political decisions made in Washington, crucial commercial deals negotiated in New York, and personal family news could take weeks to travel from the East Coast to California, often arriving long after they ceased to matter. The Express, by cutting this delivery time down to just 10 days, suddenly brought Californians into sync with the rest of the nation. Businesses could now operate with greater confidence, newspapers could report on near real-time updates, and the Union felt more connected and cohesive, a sentiment that would become absolutely critical as the Civil War loomed. The cultural impact of the Pony Express was just as significant as its logistical achievements, as it quickly became the living embodiment of the American frontier spirit. Newspapers of the era romanticized the daring riders, transforming them into instant national heroes. Across the country, young men dreamed of taking up the reins, inspired by the thrilling tales of galloping through danger with a saddlebag full of the nation's destiny. The Express became mythologized even while it was still in operation, perfectly capturing the imagination of a country that was hungry for authentic symbols of courage, resilience, and unity in the face of hardship. It was a story of human grit triumphing over the vast wilderness. For all of its daring, romance, and initial triumph, the Pony Express was a venture that was ultimately doomed from its very inception. Its demise was not a matter of operational failure, but rather a matter of inevitable technological progress. As fast as the swiftest horse could possibly ride, nothing could ever hope to compete with the instantaneous speed of an electrical wire. Just 2 days after the Pony Express officially launched its first ride in April of 1860, construction began on a far more revolutionary project, the Transcontinental Telegraph, a coast-to-coast communication system that would soon be able to transmit messages from New York to San Francisco in a matter of minutes. The telegraph poles and lines marched steadily and relentlessly across the continent, with one construction crew moving westward from the Missouri River and another moving eastward from California. Every single mile of copper wire that was strung across the plains and mountains spelled another nail in the coffin of the horse-powered express. On October 24, 1861, just 18 short months after that first celebrated ride, the final telegraph wire was connected and the system went live. On that very same day, the Pony Express officially ceased operations. The thunder of hoofbeats was replaced by the quiet, rhythmic click of Morse code. Even before the telegraph rendered it obsolete, the Pony Express was hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate. Despite its legendary performance and its immense popularity with the public, the service was a complete and utter commercial disaster. The founders, Russell, Majors, and Waddell, had poured more than 700,000, a colossal sum at the time, into building the operation, and they had barely managed to recoup a fraction of that investment. Without the federal subsidy they had hoped for, and facing incredibly high operational costs for horses, riders, station upkeep, and supply logistics, the Express was never a financially sustainable business model. It was a heroic but costly proof of concept. Though it lasted only 18 months, the Pony Express galloped straight from the dusty frontier trails into the very heart of American mythology, where it remains one of the most enduring and romanticized stories in the nation's history. While in reality, it was a high-risk, short-lived, and financially ruinous business venture, in the public imagination, it was transformed into something far greater. It became a powerful and lasting symbol of individual heroism, breathtaking speed, and the relentless, indomitable spirit of the American frontier. The lone rider, silhouetted against a fiery sunset, became an iconic image of courage and determination that still resonates today. The story of the Pony Express endures for a profound and deeply resonant reason. It serves as a powerful reminder of a unique and fleeting moment in history when raw human endurance was pitted directly against the formidable obstacles of nature. It recalls a time when communication was synonymous with risk and when forging a connection across great distances required immense personal courage. The legend tells us that true speed once came not from satellites or fiber optics, but from sheer, unyielding determination and a profound willingness to ride through blinding snow, scorching desert, and suffocating darkness, with nothing but a trusty horse and a powerful dream of a more connected nation. The earliest known beer did not appear in a frosty glass mug at a tavern or in a carefully labelled bottle on a shelf. Its story begins much earlier, in a simple clay pot, nestled within a Sumerian village in ancient Mesopotamia thousands of years ago. Long before the Roman Empire rose to power or the great pyramids of Egypt touched the sky, the people of this region, specifically the Sumerians, were brewing a form of beer in a manner that was both beautifully simple and deeply sacred. They had discovered the magical transformation of grain and water into a beverage that would become a cornerstone of their civilization, a liquid bread that nourished both body and soul. For the ancient Sumerians, beer was far more than just a casual beverage for quenching thirst. It was a fundamental pillar of their society. They didn't just drink their beer, they revered it, weaving it into the very fabric of their culture. It served as a staple food, a form of currency for paying laborers, a sacred offering to their pantheon of gods, and a potent symbol of civilization itself. It is, therefore, no accident that the oldest written recipe in all of human history is not for bread or for soup, but for beer. This recipe is beautifully preserved within the lines of the Hem to Ninkasi, a text found on clay tablets dating back to around 1800 BCE, which praises the goddess of beer while laying out brewing instructions. The brewing process itself was a practice that was both highly practical and almost poetic in its execution. The Sumerians would begin by baking a special type of bread called bapir, which was made from barley and often enriched with honey or sweet dates for additional flavor and fermentable sugars. This bread was then crumbled into large earthenware jars filled with water. The mixture was then simply left to ferment naturally, with wild yeasts from the air and the vessel itself working their magic. The resulting beverage was nothing like the crisp, clear beer we know today. It was thick, cloudy, and relatively low in alcohol, more akin to a nutritious, life-sustaining gruel than a recreational drink. It was both food and hydration in one. In the social sphere of Sumer, consuming beer was very much a communal experience. Rather than drinking from individual mugs, people would often gather around large ceramic vessels and sip the thick beverage through long straws made from reeds. This clever technique not only fostered a sense of community, but also served the practical purpose of filtering out the bits of bread and other sediment that floated in the unfiltered brew. This act of communal drinking was not merely about intoxication. It was about bonding with one's neighbors, celebrating shared successes, surviving the hardships of life, and even honoring the gods who were believed to have gifted them this miraculous, life-sustaining drink. It was a ritual that bound their society together,